Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Google+ Platform Office Hours. This week, I'm sitting at a table because we're going to be doing some live coding. We're going to be writing a jQuery plugin that uses the JavaScript client library to pull activity from your Google+ page or your profile and insert it into your web page. And we're doing this in a jQuery plugin by popular demand. I sent out a little survey, so thanks for your feedback if you voted on that. So before I dive into and then after that, we'll be fielding your questions that you've asked on the Google+ platform page. So, I guess I should introduce myself first. Hi, I'm Jennifer Murphy. I'm a developer programs engineer here at Google. And what I do is I help you guys all build cool stuff using the Google+ APIs, like the stuff we're going to be working on today. But not limited just to the REST APIs. Feel free to ask questions about Hangouts apps, the plugins, or anything else as part of the Google+ platform. Okay, well, let's see what we're going to be writing today. I'll dive right into the content. So let me show you a quick demo of what we're going to build. Built it last night, and then I put it into my personal web page. So, switching over to screen sharing, you can see this on the left side. There's underneath the badge, there's a little box that shows recent activity, and that's showing recent activity from my Google+ profile. And that's, it's kind of cool on my hub page to be able to show people what I've been up to recently. And this is implemented with the jQuery plugin that we'll be building. So when you're done going through this demo, you'll be able to put something like that on your web page. So let's switch over and kind of show you a little bit of the design behind what we're building. So to accomplish that using a jQuery plugin, there's actually a few different pieces that all kind of go into it. We have our index.html file, which is the web page itself. And it's calling out to a couple things. First of all, we're going to need to include the jQuery library. And that's what we need to wire up the plugins and do all that stuff. We have our plugin itself, which will then be making use of the Google API JavaScript client library. And that will then be making calls to the Google+ REST APIs to fetch our activities. Once it's fetched our activities, the data kind of goes back up the whole stack and then renders in our HTML document. So there's a lot of pieces involved, but each one of those pieces is actually pretty simple. So we'll go through them one at a time as we implement it. So time to dive into the code. Screen share again, switching screens to my IDE where we'll be doing the coding. Let me make it a little smaller so it's easier for you guys to see on the web page. So what do we have open? I mentioned that there's an HTML file, which is what we have open right now. And the jQuery plugin are the two files we're going to be editing during this live coding session. Let's take a look at the HTML file first. It's a skeleton. It looks a lot like you'd expect a lot of jQuery demos to look. We have all of our libraries loaded that we're going to need. We have jQuery itself loaded off of googleapis.com because CDNI's libraries are great. They're fast and easy to use. We have our plugin, which is right now styled as a plugin, which I'll be going through in a moment. And we also have the Google JavaScript client library. And it's configured such that when it loads, it calls a function, Gappy ready. And this is where we'll be wiring up everything, because we need the client library to be fully loaded before we can invoke our plugin. Scrolling down the page, there's a couple of divs, recent activity and recent activity 2. So these are places where we're going to be inserting the activity into the page using the jQuery plugin. So if you've done jQuery before, this should look pretty straightforward. Next, let's take a look at the plugin. Here's an empty plugin. It's kind of a skeleton that I used to build a lot of my jQuery plugins. If you've done plugin development in jQuery before, this should look pretty familiar, but you can ignore a lot of it if you haven't done the development. Up on the top, a lot of it's just kind of boilerplate jQuery. But near the top, there's a settings area, and this is where the configuration any configuration for our plugin will get, all the defaults will be set. Then there's more kind of boilerplate namespacing and the primary iterator that goes through and so that if we operate over a collection of objects, it'll work on all of them. And then finally, do stuff. This is where we'll actually be implementing our stuff. And then the other file I have open is nothing more than the JavaScript client library sample. So I just went to the documentation, grabbed the sample code right out of the wiki page, and pasted it into here. And I did that because writing code from scratch, especially the first time, it can be pretty challenging. So I usually will work from samples if I can. So what we're going to be doing is we're probably going to be copying a lot of the code out of the sample and then modifying it to fit our needs. Okay, we've seen what we have open. Let's get into the code. So the first thing we should do is probably wire stuff together, because we have our HTML file, but we don't actually have, the plugin's not actually being called yet. And we're going to be calling the plugin from gappy.ready. This is a little bit different than a lot of jQuery you write, because you usually probably trigger your jQuery from the onload of the document itself, like the ready. But we need all of the pieces to be ready. In addition to the document, we need the JavaScript client library to be ready. So that's why we're using a different function to kind of line it all up. So we're going to be operating below. What we're going to do first is we're going to replace the recent activity div with the contents with some activities. So let's see what we're going to write here for the jQuery. We're going to do a selector. For the recent activity, except spelled right. And that's going to use jQuery to grab that recent activity div, and then we're going to call our plugin, which is just the name of the function in the plugin. So, and then we're going to pass in any configuration that we want. This is where we have to do a little bit of thinking. So for the REST API to be able to call our activity, to get access our public activity, we need a minimum of 2 fields. We need an API key, which you can get by going to the API console and registering a new project, which is covered in a previous video, which I'll link to in the show notes. So we're going to need an API key at the minimum. And we're also going to need to know the ID of the profile or page from which we're getting our activities, so user ID. And I've already done these, so I'll just paste in values. Here's an API key. And here is the user ID of my profile on Google+, my personal profile. So this ID you can either get by looking at the page and copying it out of the URL, or you can, by the page itself, or you can access it using the API Explorer to get the profile. There's a lot of ways to get it, which is also covered in another video that I'll link to in the show notes. But once we have both of these values in, we're pretty much wired up in terms of the content that we have to add to the HTML file. This is a good starting point for where we're going to be going. So switching over to the plugin, you see that luckily the name we chose in the HTML files coincidentally matches the name of our plugin, so it's going to be called. And let's just dive into the do stuff part. So what does do stuff mean for this plugin? There's a few different things we're going to be doing. The first thing we're going to be doing is, let me pull up my notes. We're going to be creating a new JavaScript client. So we'll create a JavaScript client. We'll tell it, what APIs we're going to be calling. We'll set all the configuration for it. Then we're going to be fetching our activity, and finally we'll be rendering it into the page. Seems pretty straightforward, and it will be. So first, let's create our JavaScript client. This is where we're going to be invoking the sample that I copied from the wiki page. Reading through the sample, it's pretty short. It's only like 30 lines of code. We can see that it already shows us how to create a client library during the load function. So gappy.client.load is what we need to run. So let's just copy that, paste it into our plugin. The only differences are our API key is coming from the settings that were passed into the plugin when we called it. So settings.api key, and we're calling a different API. The sample from the wiki page uses the URL shortener. We're going to be calling the plus API. And it calls a make request function. We can just put a function in line here. So now what will happen is we set our API key and we have a client library all set up. So let's now, from within this function, we'll fetch the activity and then render it into our page. So it's not out activity, it's our activity. So we need to learn, now that we have the client library created, we need to actually get the data, make the call. Let's lean back on our sample again and see how it did it. It ran this make request function, which is right up here. And you can see that it creates a request object and then executes it. Creating the request object has the name of the method, or it has the method description here. So it's using the URL shortener to do a URL get. We can copy this and modify it too. So we'll just copy this out, paste it in here, and modify it to fit our needs. So we're going to be doing plus, or actually client dot plus dot activities dot list. And you're probably wondering how I knew those names for this function. These are the names of the functions for the RESTful API, so you can either go to the reference docs to look them up, or I usually use the API Explorer, which I'll link in the show notes. The identifiers in the API Explorer, the names of the methods and the names of the APIs, actually match these exactly. So you can copy and paste right into here, which is what I did while I was developing it. So now that we've created a REST request that gets activities, or that lists our activities, we need to pass in those two critical parameters at the very least. So let's pass in our API key. Or actually, the API key we already configured above. We need to pass in our user ID. Sorry. Here we go. And that's also going to come from settings, because we passed it in when we created the plugin, or when we invoked the plugin from our HTML file. There are a couple other required parameters, which you can see from the reference docs, or actually there's one other required parameter, which you can see from the reference docs or the API Explorer. We need to specify a collection which is a string, and there's only one valid option, which is public. And we should probably also specify one of the optional parameters. By default, this API returns 10 activities, which could take up a lot of space. So let's specify max results value. And let's do 5 for now. So now that we've created our request with all the required parameters and one of the optional parameters, we'll execute it. And the function in the sample, they just appended the results. So that's where we'll be doing our rendering stuff. But we don't need to call an append results function, which is the function defined in that sample. We'll just put the rendering here. So at this step, what I'll usually do is log the response object and take a look at what the response object looks like in debugging tools like the Chrome debug tools or Firebug or something like that. And it's just an object that contains, a bunch of attributes about the activities. So I usually kind of click around to see what kind of information I want, where it exists in that big old object, and then just do kind of regular HTML creation. So rather than walk you through all of that stuff, which is pretty standard jQuery, I'm going to grab a copy of it. And there we go. jQueryized, a jQuery way of creating HTML elements. So what we're doing is we're taking that response object, we're grabbing the items out of it, which is a list of all the activities in that response, and then we're iterating through those activities in the items list, and we're pulling some information out of it. We're pulling the publish date, the URL of the activity on Google+, and the content itself, the object.contents, which is the full text of the activity. And then we're creating an unordered list that contains the timestamp and then all of the activity contents. Then we take it and we append it to this, which is going to be inserting it inside of the HTML element that jQuery was called in this case our activities. So that is all the code, actually. And we can see it in action. Let me pull it up in a web browser. I'm going to switch back to my camera for a while I futz around to screen sharing. And there we go. This is my activity loaded from that plugin. Pretty cool, isn't it? And if you're actually including this in your web page, there's probably a bunch of other stuff you'll want to do. Show my screen sharing. Probably some other stuff you want to do. You'll probably want to do some additional formatting on the content that you're rendering in your web page. You probably don't want the whole activity to be posted. Or maybe you want to include information about whether it was a reshare or if there was an image attached, you may want to render that image within this widget. That all kind of comes down to the details of that last section of the plugin. But it's really just that simple. And like under 100 lines of code, we have a starting point for implementing a way to include your content on any external web page, which is a great way to show people where you're active on the internet. Cool. Okay. So the code for that is already up in version control. I'll be linking to it from the show notes. So you'll be able to go in there and grab the code. And especially when it's on air, sometimes it's kind of hard to see the tiny window. The text doesn't render quite great. So you'll be able to walk through the code yourself. You'll be able to drop a running version into your pages and play with it and all that cool stuff. So hope you have fun with that. So now that live coding's through, let's answer some of your questions. So I'm going to pull up the page and take a look at what you guys have been discussing while I've been yammering over here about my code. Cool. Well, you guys asked some great questions before the Hangout started, so I'm going to start by answering some of these. So Jeffrey asked, are there beta testing abilities for account holders, including businesses who have pages? This is a great question. It's always cool to stay ahead of the curve, especially if you are a publisher who has included our publisher widgets, our publisher plugins on your web pages. For example, the +1 button or the badge. It's really important that you stay a little bit ahead of the curve. And we actually have a program specifically for the publisher features, for the plugins, that enable you to do this. So what you can do is there's a form you can go to today. You punch in your Google account, your Gmail account, and then whenever we're about to push new features for the plugins, you'll see them early, either a few days early for small changes or maybe a couple weeks early for larger changes or new releases. You'll see them when you're logged into that account in the new version, which allows you to adjust all of your web designs potentially to new color schemes and things like that. And we definitely listen to all the feedback that comes from that program, so I will share that in the show notes. But that is just for the plugins. We don't really have any beta programs for other features of the platform right now, but it's always something we're investigating. But I'll put a link to the sign-up form for the publisher preview in the show notes. Thanks. So Hector asked, any news on when the API will be available or when more desktop features are coming to mobile, like URL summaries and image previews? I have great news for you. We have APIs already. In fact, I just showed you how to use some of them. And the APIs are a lot more broad than the RESTful APIs that I just showed you. In addition to the RESTful APIs, which give you access to public data on Google+, such as posts, profiles, and comments, we also have some other really cool features. We have the social plugins that allow you to insert, to kind of link up your external sites to Google+ via the +1 button to enable sharing, via the badge so people can know about your presence on Google+. And those are pretty powerful. But my favorite right now, the most fun part, in my opinion, is the Hangout apps, which are a great way to write interactive programs that run within a Hangout, like the Hangout we're doing right now. And they're a ton of fun. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can write. And there's a lot of cool apps out there already. So moving on, Stephen asks about moderation features in Hangouts. We're using Hangouts right now. I'm definitely a big Hangout user, so I totally understand why you want more moderation features, especially if you're using Hangouts for things that are beyond just a regular informal, meeting between friends. When you're using them for more sophisticated purposes, it would be really cool to have moderation controls to be able to kind of manage a Hangout, maybe schedule one ahead of time, all that kind of stuff. This is great feedback. Unfortunately, this is probably something we're not going to implement initially as a feature of the platform. So I can't really talk to it in a lot of detail. It's something that we're going to have to implement as a core feature first. So like all of the kind of Google Plus recommendations I get, I'd like to ask you to please do me a favor. There's a send feedback link in the lower corner of the web page, depending on which language you're in. It's either the right or left corner. So click on the send feedback link and send this feedback to us. We listen to this feedback. It automatically gets routed to the right team. It may get aggregated, but people are definitely listening to this feedback. And you may not get a response, but someone's definitely listening. So please send details about what kind of moderation features you'd like to see in Hangouts via the send feedback tool. I'd really appreciate that. Thanks. And Danny asks, when can I have Hangouts on air? The very feature you're watching me on right now. So Hangouts on air is not ready for prime time yet. We're still in a testing phase, and it's a big feature. So we're taking our time to make sure it's really polished before we pass it out to everyone else. So please hang tight. I don't really have a lot. I don't know when it will be available, and I don't know when we can roll it out to more people. But hang tight right now. Keep an eye on the Google+ blog. When it's ready, you'll definitely see news there, and then you'll be able to dig in. And next up is Furkan. Furkan, I hope I got your name right. Hi, Furkan. We talked a little bit last week too. You mentioned that you were having an issue where the numbers on Google Analytics, Google Webmaster Tools, and your +1 button that describe your social interactions were a little bit out of sync, or a lot out of sync. So we're still investigating this. And as you've noticed, the count's gone up on the +1 button on your web page. So we're continuing to investigate this. And I don't have like a final answer yet, which is why I haven't responded to the issue that you filed on the issue tracker, which you mentioned in your comment. But I do have a little bit I can tell you about kind of what we're digging around in there and finding. Google Analytics takes a little bit of a different approach to social tracking than Webmaster Tools and the +1 button count itself. Webmaster Tools and the +1 button count, the count on the button itself, are really focused on the +1 button. So they're able to keep track of when someone unclicks the +1 button or when a +1 is excluded for some reason. Google Analytics, on the other hand, is a much more generic social tracking tool. It tracks +1s out of the box, but you can pretty easily configure it to track tweets, you can configure it to track Facebook likes, and pretty much any other social interaction via the JavaScript hooks they provide. And this is really powerful, but as a result of it being a very generic feature, it has a little bit less insight into exactly what it's tracking. The gist of it is it tracks social activities and not +1s. So if someone comes in on +1s a page, Google Analytics isn't going to reduce that count. It only counts up because it's kind of a record of all the social activities that have happened historically. So that's why Google Analytics is usually going to register a little bit higher, and there is a bigger discrepancy on your page. So we're still investigating, but I will respond to the issue once we have a final answer. But I thought you would appreciate an update since you were nice enough to keep us up to date. So thanks a lot. Okay, and that's all of the questions I saw that were posted before, so bear with me as I dig through the comments that have been asked during the show. So there's some questions about the new Google Plus user interface. It's still rolling out. It's pretty cool. I like it a lot. And it is still rolling out across, so you may not see it yet. Just hang tight, it'll be there soon. As with all of our releases, a lot of these things kind of go gradually, just because we want to make sure it's rolling out well before we keep pushing it to everyone. And Michael Tucker mentioned that it can be a little tricky to run a chat during a Hangout, and it can help to have an extra person doing production work. And that's actually what we're doing right now. Julia is behind the camera right now, making sure that my audio levels are appropriate and all that stuff, and that's actually really good advice. If you're running Hangout on air, or if you're just doing a high-profile Hangout at all, it helps to have someone who's not on camera who's kind of managing and making sure all the data flows right and that the sound levels are all good, and can shoot a Nerf dart at you when you're talking too quietly. So great advice. We've learned that too, and it helps so much. Danny, you asked why you couldn't join the Hangout at 11:30. Because of the nature of the Hangout on air, we keep it a little bit more limited audience, just to make sure that we can keep it focused. But I definitely like to open up these Hangouts to developers. So if you have a question, when you ask it on the thread, just mention that you'd like to ask it in person. And then what will happen is we'll loop back with you, and we'll arrange, we'll communicate and arrange all the timing and stuff so that you can join the Hangout in person. And that goes for all of you out there. So if any of you have something you'd like to discuss on the Hangout on air, just ping us ahead of time, whoever created the Hangout announcement. And we'll talk to you and see if we can get you in here. Because we always like talking to developers in person via the Hangout. It's so much better. So there's a great question in there from Fabio. Hi, is it possible when using the activity search method, for example, querying for a specific hashtag, to only get the activities created after a previous search? So it sounds like you're trying to build a continuous feed of activities for a specific hashtag. Right now there's no way to filter by date. It's something that would be really powerful for implementing this kind of feature. For now, you're going to have to do a little bit more work on your side. So when I've tried to implement this stuff in the past, I've just had to keep track of the activities I've already seen and just keep paging past until I think I've gotten most of them. So it's a little bit fuzzy, and there is the possibility you're going to miss some. But you can implement this functionality. And the way I've done it once is I would page through a few times every time I hit the API, and then I would take the activities that I've already seen and stick them into a Bloom filter or a cache of some kind. Then, when I do the fetch again, I take all the activities that I grabbed, compare them against that, and then display them as output from my application. And this has the added benefit of, if they've been updated, I would display the updated version too, which is kind of cool. So it can be implemented. It requires a little extra work on your side, and we understand that adding that filter would make it better. So we'll look into doing that. Thanks for the feedback. Okie doke. So I guess we're going to be wrapping it up a couple minutes early today. Thanks for joining me for the live coding. And I have one quick announcement to make before we finish. We're actually going to be, up until now, we've been pretty good about doing these Hangouts, these office hours every week. We're actually going to be cutting back a little bit starting sometime in a few weeks. So we'll be back next week, but after that we're probably going to reduce our schedule to about every other week or twice a month. We want to be able to do this. We're doing this so that we can produce smaller amount but a higher quality content. So we're going to focus a little bit more time on what we're presenting and make sure it's always great. And in the weeks we're not on air, you can still reach us via Stack Overflow, our support forum, our Plus page, or all the existing channels. So we're still around. We just won't be on air quite as often. So that's all we have for today. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys all on the forums and on the Plus page. Bye, everyone.